Chapter 4. Imhotep. They could hear the scarabs, hundreds of them, and then they saw them. They all wanted to scream, but there wasn't time. Evelyn, Jonathan, and O'Connell ran up some stairs. The scarabs ran past below them. "They almost got us," said O'Connell. "Evelyn, I said—" But Evelyn wasn't there. She lost O'Connell and Jonathan when they ran up the stairs. She walked into a dark room below them. Where was she? She didn't know.
"O'Connell!"
Evelyn shouted.
"O'Connell!"
Then she saw one of the Americans. He had his back to her, but it was Burns.
"Oh, hello,"
said Evelyn. Burns turned around and she screamed. Burns had no eyes. He fell on the ground. Evelyn turned away, but she came face to face with Imhotep. Imhotep with Burns's blue eyes. Imhotep couldn't see very well because Burns had to wear glasses. He looked at Evelyn. "Anck-su-namun," he said.
"Help me,"
Evelyn said to Burns. But Burns couldn't see, and he could do nothing. "Kadish Pharaohs Anck-su-namun," said Imhotep. Evelyn was very afraid.
"I'm going to die," she thought. "Please, somebody help me."
Suddenly, O'Connell ran in with a gun in his hand. "Oh, there you are," he said to Evelyn. "Where—" He saw Imhotep. He shot Imhotep and pulled Evelyn to him. Then he took Evelyn's hand in his hand, and they ran. Ardeth Bey and 10 Medjay soldiers stopped them. "I told you before, leave this place or die," said Ardeth Bey. "It's okay," said O'Connell. "I shot the mummy. No problem." "A gun can't kill Imhotep," said Ardeth Bey. He was very angry. "Now get out of here, all of you!" Medjay soldiers found the Americans and Jonathan, and they all went back above ground. Only one person wasn't there. Benny was below the ground. He was with Imhotep. "I can use you," Imhotep told Benny in Egyptian. "And I will give you gold."
"Yes,"
said Benny. "I want the box with Anck-su-namun's heart," Imhotep told him. Above ground, Medjay soldiers helped Burns walk to a horse. "What did you do to him?" shouted Henderson, the 3rd American. "Look at his eyes." "We helped him," said Ardeth Bey. "Now leave here before Imhotep kills everybody." They all got on their horses. They wanted to get away from Imhotep. "I got him," said O'Connell. "I told you. I shot this Imhotep." But nobody listened to him. Nobody could kill Imhotep with a gun. Back in Cairo, Evelyn and O'Connell took Burns to his hotel room. Then they went to O'Connell's room. They sat and shouted angrily. "Let's go, Evelyn. We're out of here," shouted O'Connell.
"No, we are not," shouted Evelyn. "We started this. Now we'll kill Imhotep and finish it."
"We?" shouted O'Connell. "We? You read from the Book of the Dead, and nobody can kill this Imhotep. Not with a gun. I tried."
"Then we'll kill him some other way,"
said Evelyn. A white cat came into the room and jumped on the bed. O'Connell started to say something, but then they heard a scream from Burns's room. Imhotep was in Burns's room with Benny. He wanted Burns's heart. He had to have it so he could come back to life. And he took it. Burns gave one scream. Then he was dead on the floor.
"Oh, no!"
cried Evelyn when she and O'Connell ran into Burns's room. O'Connell took out his gun. He and Evelyn watched Imhotep. He had new life with Burns's heart inside him. "We have a problem," said O'Connell. Imhotep wanted Evelyn. He moved to her. O'Connell shot him again and again, but nothing happened. Imhotep threw O'Connell across the room. He fell on the floor in front of Jonathan, Henderson, and Daniels when they ran in. Imhotep spoke to Evelyn. "You gave me my life," he said. "I thank you." He moved his face close to her and almost kissed her. But suddenly the white cat ran into the room. Imhotep saw it, and he was afraid. He stopped kissing Evelyn and ran out of the room. "What happened?" asked O'Connell.
"The priests in Seti's time had white cats," said Evelyn. "The cats sat at the doors of the afterlife."
"That's good," said O'Connell. "But we have big problems." Henderson looked at Burns on the floor. "Am I next?" he said. "I was in the room when we found that book." "And me," said Daniels.
"I have an idea," said Evelyn. "The Book of the Dead gave Imhotep life. We want him dead. So
the other book," said Jonathan.
"Yes, the Book of Amun-Ra can send him back to the underworld," said Evelyn. "The Book of Amun-Ra is at Hamunaptra. But where in Hamunaptra?" "The museum. Let's go to the museum. We can find the answer there."
"I'll wait here," said Henderson. "Me too," said Daniels. Henderson went back to his hotel room. Daniels went back to his room, too. He looked at the gold box and smiled. Outside, the scarabs were everywhere, and more people came back to half-life. They were mummies, and they followed Imhotep. The streets were full of the undead. They walked slowly, and they repeated Imhotep's name again and again. Jonathan, Evelyn, and O'Connell walked to Jonathan's car and drove slowly to the museum. The undead looked into the car, but Jonathan didn't stop. At the museum, they found the curator. Ardeth Bey was with him. "This is the end of the world," said Ardeth Bey. "We cannot stop the undead, and we cannot stop Imhotep." Evelyn looked at book after book. She read for hours. And then,
"This is it. The Book of Amun-Ra is in the statue of the god Horus."
"Let's go!" shouted O'Connell. O'Connell, Evelyn, Jonathan, the curator, and Ardeth Bey drove back to the hotel and went to Henderson's room. He was dead. But Daniels was okay, and he ran with them back to the car. He had his gold box with him. Back in the car, Jonathan drove slowly. The undead were everywhere in the streets. There were hundreds of them. They shouted, "Imhotep! Imhotep!" Then they looked into the car and saw the box. Jonathan drove fast, but the undead stopped the car. Daniels shot at them again and again, but more of the undead walked to the car. "Imhotep! Imhotep!" They looked at Daniels with dead eyes. Then they took him out of the car and killed him. It was quiet in the car for a minute. Then the undead came for O'Connell, Jonathan, Evelyn, the curator, and Ardeth Bey.
"This is not good,"
Evelyn thought. Then she saw him. Imhotep. The undead took the gold box and gave it to Imhotep. Benny was with him. Evelyn, O'Connell, and the other men got out of the car. "Wait," said Imhotep to the undead. The undead waited. Imhotep walked to Evelyn.
"Do you have any ideas?"
Evelyn asked O'Connell. I'm thinking, he said. Imhotep put out his hand to Evelyn. "I am living because of you," he said. "Come with me." "He has Anck-su-namun's heart," said Ardeth Bey. "Now he wants your heart, too, so he can bring her back from the undead." Imhotep's hand closed around Evelyn's. Evelyn turned to O'Connell.
"I give my heart to you,"
she said.
"But please, come for it before he takes it out."
O'Connell almost smiled at that. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Imhotep took Evelyn away. Then he turned and shouted to the undead. "Kill them all!" "Run!" shouted Ardeth Bey. The head of the Medjai called for his soldiers. He took his sword and fought with the undead. The curator fought too, but the undead killed him. O'Connell and Jonathan ran. "We can't leave Ardeth Bey," shouted Jonathan. "Yes, we can," said O'Connell. "We're going to Hamunaptra. We're going to find that statue and the book." Chapter 5. The Book of Amun-Ra. "How do we know this god?" asked O'Connell. "Horus," said Jonathan. "He has a big nose. Look for a big bird. That will be him." "Okay," said O'Connell. "Where do we start?" He looked at the houses and the temple in Hamunaptra. He had no ideas. Below O'Connell and Jonathan, Benny had a gun in Evelyn's back. Imhotep was in front of them. "Walk," said Benny.
"You'll die in the end,"
said Evelyn. "I will," said Benny.
"Oh, yes,"
said Evelyn. But she walked. They came to the Sa-Netjer. At the same time, Ardeth Bey and the Medjai were on their way across the desert. When Jonathan and O'Connell went down under the ground near the statue of Anubis, Imhotep heard them. He took some water from the gold box with Anck-su-nu-man's heart in it and threw it at a wall. His mummified priests from 3,000 years before walked in. "Find them," said Imhotep. Jonathan and O'Connell found the statue of Horus. Then the mummified priests found them. Ardeth Bey and his soldiers came in and fought with the mummified priests. "Does anybody have a white cat?" asked Jonathan. "Find the book," shouted Ardeth Bey. Back in the Sa-Netjer, Evelyn was in a coffin. The coffin was open, but she couldn't move her arms or her legs. In the next coffin was the mummy of Anck-su-namun. Imhotep sang. He had the Book of the Dead in one hand, and he put the other hand on Anck-su-namun's dead face.
"This is a love story," thought Evelyn. "He loved her for 3,000 years, and now I'm going to die for his love."
Ardeth Bey and his soldiers fought hard, but there were more and more mummies. When they shot a mummy in the arm came off. Then it fought too. Jonathan and O'Connell didn't stop digging. And then they found a gold box, and in the gold box there was the Book of Amun-Ra. It was beautiful, but they couldn't look at it now. "Take the book and help the girl!" Ardeth Bey shouted. Imhotep read from the Book of the Dead. When you die, he told Evelyn, Ankh-Sunamun will live, and I will never die.
Ankh-Sunamun's eyes opened. Imhotep opened the coffin and took a knife. He stood with it over Evelyn's heart. This was the end. Suddenly, O'Connell and Jonathan ran into the room. Imhotep turned to them. "I found it, Evie!" Jonathan shouted. He showed her the Book of Amun-Ra. "I found it!" "Stop talking!" Evelyn shouted at her brother. "Get me out of here!" Imhotep put the knife down and walked to Jonathan. "Open the book, Jonathan!" Evelyn shouted. "That's the only way!" Jonathan tried, but he couldn't open it. "Is there a key?" he asked. Imhotep smiled. He had the key. He moved nearer to Jonathan. O'Connell took a sword from a statue's hand and started to cut into Evelyn's coffin. "Imhotep's going to kill Jonathan," thought Evelyn. She thought quickly. "Jonathan, are there any words on the front of the book?" Jonathan ran away from Imhotep and looked at the book at the same time. "Words?" he said. "Yes." O'Connell started to break the coffin. Imhotep turned and called the mummified priests back into the Sa-Neter. Jonathan tried to read the Egyptian writing on the front of the Book of Amun-Ra. Why didn't he listen carefully in Egyptian classes at school? O'Connell pulled Evelyn from the coffin. Jonathan read the words. "Rasheen Ulu Kashka," he said. The big doors to the room opened. 10 mummified soldiers walked into the room. A new kind of mummy, worse than the other soldiers. "Tell the soldiers that you're the boss," said Evelyn. "Who? Me?" said Jonathan. "Finish the words on the front of the book, you stupid boy." "Oh, yes," said Jonathan. "The book! The book!" Above Jonathan, in a room full of gold, Benny was a happy man. Here was the gold of the pharaohs. He carried a lot of gold up to his big white horse and put it in some bags on the horse. Then he went down again for more gold. Below, in the Sa-Neter, Imhotep walked to Jonathan and looked down at him. Jonathan looked at the book. "I can't read this," he screamed to Evelyn. "This Egyptian letter. There are 2 lines at the top, 1 line at the bottom. There's a little—" "It's an ankh," said Evelyn. "Ah!" Soldier mummies fought with O'Connell. He was on the ground. Their swords were above him. "Hutash im Amenephus!" shouted Jonathan. The soldier mummies stopped. Imhotep looked back at them. The soldier mummies looked at Jonathan. "Why are you looking at me?" Jonathan asked them. "You're their boss now," shouted Evelyn. Tell them."
"Tell them what?" said Jonathan. Anck-su-namun started to get up from her coffin. She wanted her life. She hit Evelyn again and again. Evelyn screamed.
"Jonathan!"
screamed Evelyn.
"Tell the soldiers! Stop her!"
"Oh, yes, right," said Jonathan. And then, "Fakushka Anck-su-namun!" Anck-su-namun took her knife and put it above Evelyn's heart. But the soldier mummies jumped across the room and killed her. Imhotep screamed when he saw the love of his life die again. He jumped on Jonathan and took the Book of Amun-Ra from his hands. "Now you die," he said. O'Connell ran across the room and cut Imhotep's arm off with the statue's sword. Imhotep smiled. Nobody could kill him. He took Jonathan in his other hand. "Okay, so he can fight with his left hand," said O'Connell. But the Book of Amun-Ra was now on the floor, and the key was on the floor too. Evelyn got out of the coffin and ran to the key. She opened the book. O'Connell pulled Imhotep away from Jonathan. Imhotep turned and threw O'Connell across the room. Evelyn looked into the Book of Amun-Ra.
"Can you fight with Imhotep for 3 or 4 minutes? Please,"
she shouted to O'Connell. Imhotep threw O'Connell across the room again with his one arm. "No problem," O'Connell answered. Imhotep took O'Connell's sword. "You are going to die," he said. Evelyn read from the gold book.
"Kadish Mal!"
she shouted.
"Kadish Mal! Parid Us! Parid Us!"
Imhotep turned. He was very afraid. How did she know these words? They were the end for him. The god Anubis came into the room. He walked through Imhotep and left again. Imhotep was now a man. Only a man. And a man can die. O'Connell took the sword and pushed it through Imhotep. And Imhotep, the man, died. But he said something before he died. He said, "This is not the end." Above them, Benny found gold on the wall of a room. His eyes opened. He smiled. He took out his knife and pulled the gold off the wall. The room came down on top of him. He remembered Evelyn's words.
"You'll die in the end."
"Yes," said Benny. And he died. "Run!" shouted O'Connell. "The place is coming down!" Jonathan, Evelyn, and O'Connell ran up above ground, and Hamunaptra fell back into the desert behind them. Now there was nothing there. They found 3 horses and got on them. Then they started across the desert, away from Hamunaptra. A hand fell on Jonathan's arm. Jonathan screamed. "Oh, it's you," he said. "Thank you very much." "No, I thank you," said Ardeth Bay. He looked at O'Connell and Evelyn. "From all my people, I thank you. Imhotep is dead, and now there are no undead or scarabs in the city of Cairo." "Oh, that's okay, my friend," said Jonathan. "Thanks are fine," he thought, "but we didn't get any gold." Ardeth Bay smiled and went off into the desert. "My horse is walking slowly," said Jonathan. Then he stopped and looked in the bags on the big white horse. "Evelyn!" he shouted. "Gold!" But Evelyn was busy. She put her arms around O'Connell, and they kissed. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe it was the beginning.